Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker for a very busy show tonight. As you'll probably know, MPs are debating amendments about whether or not to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. There's a demonstration in Parliament Square. We're going to be giving you all the updates as they come in. To talk me through the evening's events, I'm joined by Rivkah Brown. Coming up on tonight's show, we'll talk about the Supreme Court decision to make it impossible for the government to send people to Rwanda at the moment. Rishi Sunak has a response. He's going to change the law. By decree, Rwanda will become safe, we are told. And we will also be giving you the latest updates from Gaza. MPs will soon be voting on 2 amendments to the King's speech that would demand a ceasefire in Gaza. One of the amendments has been put forward by Labour backbenchers, including Zara Sultana and Richard Bergen, and the other is from the SNP. But both Labour and the Tories have whipped their MPs not to vote for them. Starmer isn't speaking in the debate, but his team told Politico his position hasn't changed since he gave this speech 2 weeks ago.
While I understand calls for a ceasefire at this stage, I do not believe that it is the correct position now, for 2 reasons. One, because a ceasefire always freezes any conflict in the state where it currently lies. And as we speak, that would leave Hamas with the infrastructure and the capability to carry out the sort of attack we saw on October the 7th. Attacks that are still ongoing. Hostages who should be released still held. Hamas would be emboldened and start preparing for future violence immediately. And it is this context which explains my second reason, which is that our current calls for pauses in the fighting for clear and specific humanitarian purposes, and which must start immediately, is right in practice as well as principle.
That was a terrible argument 2 weeks ago, and it's a terrible argument now. As Israeli officials keep saying publicly, this assault on Gaza is not just about removing Hamas or weakening Hamas. It is about making Gaza unlivable. Now, these are just some recent quotes from Gazan officials, from Israeli officials, sorry. The first one is from an anonymous Israeli defense official who said this: Gaza will eventually turn into a city of tents. There will be no buildings. Another key advisor, this time to the defense minister, said this: Israel needs to create a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, compelling tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands to seek refuge in Egypt or the Gulf. The entire population of Gaza will either move to Egypt or move to the Gulf. Now, those statements were both made in the week after the October the 7th attacks, and Israel's actions have been in line with those words. According to the UN, Israel has now destroyed or damaged more than 50% of buildings in Gaza, and the humanitarian crisis is extreme, beyond words. 4,500 children have already been killed. Hospitals are out of fuel and under attack, and virtually the whole strip is out of water. This is not a surgical operation to take out Hamas. This is a war against an entire people. This is what those who oppose a ceasefire are enabling. Right? This is what Starmer is arguing should continue. Now, of course, the part of the plan that Israel still hasn't achieved is expelling people from Gaza. Its 2.2 million inhabitants living under constant fear of death are still there. But more recent comments from Israeli ministers show expulsion is still on the agenda. Just yesterday, Israel's finance minister said this: the acceptance of refugees by the countries of the world who truly care about Gazans' well-being, with the support and generous economic support of the international community, including the State of Israel, is the only solution that will bring an end to the suffering of Jews and Arabs both. So he's saying kicking people out, people becoming refugees elsewhere in the world, that is the only solution. There is no solution for Israel which involves Gazans living in Gaza, Palestinians living in Gaza. 2 days earlier, the deputy speaker of the Knesset, who is a member of Netanyahu's party, put that strategy in even more brutal terms. We need to put them, the Palestinians, on boats and send them wherever will be good for them. They're wanted in Scotland, we'll hand them over. I'm not sure if that's a dig at Hamza Youssef, but Clearly, that is someone saying he wants all the Gazans to leave, doesn't really care where they go. Israel's agriculture minister has also made explicit what the appropriate historical comparison here is. He has said, "We are now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. From an operational point of view, there is no way to wage a war, as the IDF seeks to do in Gaza, with masses between the tanks and the soldiers. Gaza Nakba 2023. That's how it'll end." Now, if you regularly watch the show, you know what the Nakba is. The Nakba is in 1945, when Israel was created and 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes. It was an act of ethnic cleansing. The Palestinians call it a Nakba, the catastrophe. And you've got an Israeli minister there saying that's what's going to happen again. It's going to be the Nakba 2023. We're going to drive the Palestinians out of their homes in Gaza. We're going to complete the job that we started in 1948, essentially. So this is what letting Israel fight on is allowing them to do, right? Every extra day Israel gets to bomb Gaza doesn't just mean hundreds more innocent lives being lost, more children with dead fathers, more mothers with dead children, and more families wiped off the map. It also means one more day where Israel is able to create new facts on the ground to achieve Netanyahu's long-term aim of emptying Gaza. And that ambition really is long-term. In 1979, Max Hastings wrote a book about Netanyahu's brother. It included this passage. "At Bibi Netanyahu's dinner table in Jerusalem, I listened with crawling dismay to Bibi talking about the future of his country. Quote, 'In the next war, if we do it right, we'll have a chance to get all the Arabs out,' he said. 'We can clear the West Bank, sort out Jerusalem.' He joked about the Golani Brigade, the Israeli infantry force in which so many men were North African or Yemenite Jews. 'They're okay as long as they're led by white officers,' he grinned." So every day we let Israel continue to bomb Gaza is a day we let Bibi Netanyahu get closer to that genocidal aim, stated 40 years ago. And if we look at the facts on the ground, if we look at the number of buildings that have been destroyed, it seems pretty clear that he's trying to put that into practice today. So what have Labour MPs had to say for their position of opposing these pro-ceasefire amendments? Well, this was Pat McFadden on Radio 4 this morning.
The problem with simply saying ceasefire now is it leaves the Hamas capability and intent in place. And we heard from the Hamas spokesperson, Mr. Ghazi Hamad, a week or so ago, saying that what happened on October the 7th, the greatest slaughter of Israeli civilians since the end of the war, was an intent that Hamas had to repeat a second, a third, and a fourth time. Look, I understand why people want this to stop. I want this to stop. Everybody wants the violence in Gaza to stop and the humanitarian crisis there to end. But I think we have to raise our sights above simply calling for a ceasefire. And the pattern in the past 10 years has been rockets are fired, there are outbreaks of hostilities, and then it repeats itself in a year or two's time. International opinion can now see that process of repeated conflict and containment has failed. And we need to come out of this with something bigger and more ambitious than just saying a ceasefire now.
I mean, on the one hand, just so dishonest. We need something bigger and more ambitious than saying just a ceasefire. Now, no one is saying just a ceasefire, right? People are saying have a ceasefire so we can put some pressure on both sides to come to some solution which is relatively just, right? No one's saying, oh, just stop the bombing and then forget about Palestine again, right? I say ceasefire, then put sanctions on Israel so that they can no longer illegally expand their settlements in the West Bank and there is some chance of a two-state solution. Other people say we should have a ceasefire and what we should do is put sanctions on Israel so they are forced to give Palestinians between the river and the sea the vote and you have a one-state secular state. Right? I'm actually fine with both of them. But either way, we have a ceasefire to save lives now, to stop Israel changing facts on the ground so that it can ultimately make Gaza unlivable and what they want to do is clear it of its population, right? How does that help us get to that end? It doesn't make any sense. Also, there was some worrying logic at the start of that clip, right? Because McFadden's argument appears to be this. If political leaders do and say extremely violent things, we should bomb and flatten the homes, schools, and hospitals of their people, right? A Hamas leader has said some extreme things. Hamas have done some extreme things. Therefore, we should bomb the hospitals of the Gazans. Now, as I hope my introduction has shown, if that were the case, we should already be carpet bombing Tel Aviv, right? If political leaders saying extreme things means you get to bomb their capital city, then why don't we have planes over Tel Aviv dropping bombs on civilian infrastructure? Now, of course, that's not something I would advocate, but it's the psychopathic logic our political class appear all too happy to go along with, so long, of course, as the victims are Palestinians. Now, it's a grotesque position, which has led many shadow ministers to consider rebelling this evening and voting for pro-ceasefire motions. But to try and minimise a rebellion, Starmer has put forward an alternative amendment. Now, this is the key passage of the frontbench amendment. While acknowledging the daily humanitarian pauses to allow in aid and the movement of civilians, this House believes they must be longer to deliver humanitarian assistance on a scale that begins to meet the desperate needs of the people of Gaza, which is a necessary step to an enduring cessation of fighting as soon as possible and a credible diplomatic and political process to deliver the lasting peace of a two-state solution. So, Labour wants Gazans to have a bit more time to get supplies in before the bombing of their homes resumes. They don't necessarily just want 4-hour humanitarian pauses. Maybe they could be 6 hours or 12 hours long. But whatever the case, people will still be getting bombed. Whole houses, whole apartment blocks, hospitals will still be collapsed. There will still be whole families who are losing their lives every single night. The second bit of this, which I find even more cowardly, is they say they want fighting to end, quote, as soon as possible. Now that is cowardly because it's a completely empty statement, right? The demand for a ceasefire now, which is in those amendments, now that means something. Stop the bombing immediately, right? We don't want to see more families die. We don't want to see more kids die. We don't want to see more civilian infrastructure taken out for no clear purpose other than ethnic cleansing, right? A ceasefire when possible means nothing. It allows Israel to say this: sure, we'll stop bombing when it's possible, but it's not possible yet. We still haven't destroyed Hamas. Oh, and we still want to make Gaza just that little bit more unlivable. Can you please stop bombing when possible? Completely meaningless. And one frontbencher who wasn't convinced by Labour's new position was Shadow Minister for Crime Reduction, Naz Shah. She said this in today's debate.
We must do what is right. Whilst it may be a matter of convention to follow our closest ally, the US, in interest of foreign policy, it is a matter of conscience to step away from our closest ally in the interest of peace. We know that eventually there will be a ceasefire in this current crisis. Every war ends with a cessation of hostilities. The question is not if there will be a ceasefire, but when. For the people of Palestine, every minute, every hour, every day we wait is another orphan, another grieving mother, and another family wiped out. This is why, in standing to save innocent lives of both Palestinians and Israelis and representing the people of Bradford West, in today's motion, I will be supporting the amendment which seeks an immediate ceasefire.
The question is not if there will be a ceasefire, but when, right? Naz Shah is exactly right. She's put that perfectly. Of course, there will be a ceasefire at some point, right? When possible, there will be a ceasefire. But the sides get to decide when possible. And given Israel has all the power, they get to decide when possible. It's only by saying now, the ceasefire should be now. Not, we hope there's a ceasefire at some point in the future. What pressure is that putting on Israel? None whatsoever. Now, Naz Shah, for taking such a reasonable position, is expected to face the sack. She has broken the Labour whip. Another frontbencher who's rebelling is Helen Hayes. She's a shadow education minister.
My conscience tells me that I must call for a ceasefire today, for a halt to this dreadful destruction and conflict where far too many have already died on both sides, and more will continue to die if the violence does not cease. We must call for a ceasefire.
MPs are still debating the ceasefire amendments. They will be voting at around 7 p.m. Over 50 Labour MPs are expected to vote for a ceasefire, and up to a dozen frontbenchers are said to be considering rebelling, and therefore, we presume, getting the sack. Rivkah, how significant do you think this vote is?
I don't think the significance of it can be overstated, really. The only comparable vote I can think of is the 2003 vote over the invasion of Iraq. I think it will go down as a major turning point in British political history. And the names of the rebels, and indeed, probably more importantly, the names of the people who followed the whip will be remembered forever. You know, quite similar to the invasion of Iraq. Whenever a Labour MP tries to attest their credentials as a defender of human rights or as a kind of progressive of any sort, their voting record on this specific amendment will be cited again and again and again. You supported genocide. I think all the more so over time as the scale of Israel's raising of Gaza and indeed attack on the West Bank as well becomes more and more egregious. You know, this, just as it will go down in British political history, I mean, it's evidently going to go down in Palestinian history, in Middle East history. And the idea that, genocide is a kind of political term or a polemical term will become more and more sort of undermined as the kind of plain fact of Israel's not just genocidal intent, but genocidal capabilities and genocidal acts becomes clear. So I think, this is another major moment when the House will be divided between politicians who consider themselves servants of their party and politicians who consider themselves servants of the people. We have to remember here that 76% of the British public, now that must include huge numbers of not just Labour voters, but Conservative voters as well as people of all stripes, people who are otherwise politically apathetic, support a ceasefire. Now, those people are going to look at the result of today's vote, and if they don't feel represented by their politicians, well, we know what happens. We know exactly what happens when the public feels like liberal democratic structures and the kind of normal systems of democracy and their elected representatives aren't listening to them. They turn more and more to further and more extreme populist figures, usually on the far right. We see it happening across Europe. Giorgia Meloni, Recep Erdogan, Donald Trump. This complete riding roughshod, as it almost definitely will be, over the kind of democratic will of the people, is going to have major implications for mistrust in our politicians, which will in turn embolden the only people in this country who appear to be taking seriously, not that I believe that they are the only people who are taking seriously, but certainly they present themselves as being the only people who take seriously the fears and feelings of the general public. And that's people like Tommy Robinson. That's people like Nigel Farage. That's people like Suella Braverman. Those are the people that are going to be emboldened by this complete and utter disregard for the will of the people tonight. In terms of Labour's kind of game playing, it's obviously going to, it's already electorally backfiring. We've seen already polls coming in that suggest that Keir Starmer has dropped something like 10 points in polls about his strong leadership qualities, and 18 points when it comes to questions of how united Labour seems. One of Keir Starmer's primary promises when he was making his bid for Labour leader was that he was going to unite a divided party. But now it appears the party is more divided perhaps than ever, and for incredibly good reason.
I think we can think of some times when Labour was a little bit more divided under Jeremy Corbyn, but Keir Starmer's authority is pretty much in place, isn't it? I mean, I think where I really do agree with you is on sort of the ethical stakes here. Now, I imagine, what would be said by sort of defenders of someone not breaking the whip now is they say, look, the difference between now and Iraq is that Iraq, that was a decision that was being made by Britain. It was the British troops who were being sent to Iraq. So that vote in Parliament sort of had an added significance because it was our war. But I think that understates the extent to which, Israel's actions in Gaza are also our actions, right? We are very much implicated. We are giving this country diplomatic cover. We send them weapons. We send them arms. And I think if a country such as the UK had voted in Parliament to call for a ceasefire, that would have significant international ramifications. So I keep seeing people on Twitter sort of saying, why are Labour MPs bothering to rebel on this when what happens in Parliament doesn't make any difference anyway? Well, I mean, you could say that about a lot of things, right? I'm sure there were MPs who said that about Iraq, in the sense of, well, this is going to pass anyway. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a majority against invading Iraq, so we might as well just vote with Tony Blair, even if we've got some doubts, right? Now, that had some political ramifications, and I think it could be that a similar thing happens here. I imagine that a future Labour leadership election, how you voted in this is going to be significant, and there are going to be lots of MPs where how they voted in this is going to be significant at the next general election, which, to be honest, is probably determining why we are seeing some frontbenchers say that this is the position which they have to, make a stand on. I'm sure a lot of them are doing it for very sort of, reasons involving integrity as well. I mean, I believe Naz Shah when she says she really cares about the Palestinians, and that it matters to her that we call for a ceasefire now, not just at some time in the future. But sort of electoral considerations will surely be coming into this with many of them. And I think, those electoral considerations are probably less about will it swing the next general election, but will it cause some serious problems for specific MPs in specific constituencies. In the long run, we potentially shouldn't understate, how much this will sort of impact people's ideas of Keir Starmer as a man with integrity. Although, at the moment, as you say, Rivkah, he has lost some points when it comes to sort of personal ratings, but Labour are still sort of 25 points ahead in the polls, largely because the Tories are a mess, which we will talk about a little bit later on the show. Let's go back to some speeches in today's debates. Now, on the backbenches, Zara Sultana is one of the MPs that tabled a pro-ceasefire motion. In the debate, she said this.
Israel's assault on Gaza has been done with this government's unequivocal support and complicity, and almost certainly with British-made arms. I can see smirking happening on the front bench. Don't think it's a laughing matter, personally speaking. So when the government refuses to support a ceasefire, it gives Israel the green light to continue its slaughter of innocent Palestinians. When it refuses to support a ceasefire, it is refusing to push back against Israeli politicians and policies that aim to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from their lands. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am horrified, utterly horrified, that after all of this, members of this House are still willing to give Israel the green light, proposing nothing more than humanitarian pauses. There is nothing humanitarian about letting children eat a little today, only to bomb them tomorrow. The only humanitarian way forward is an immediate ceasefire, as has been recognised from everyone, from the Pope to the President of France, as well as 76% of the British public, according to polling. So to members across this House, I say this. The children killed in Gaza today could have been saved by a ceasefire agreed yesterday. So I urge you, I implore you, we will be remembered for this vote. So let's be on the right side of history and vote for a ceasefire today.
That was Zara Sultana making a very well articulated argument inside Parliament. Outside Parliament, so in Parliament Square, a protest is currently taking place. The rally is organised by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who say tonight's vote is a moral test for MPs. They've also said that 125,000 people have contacted their MP to encourage them to vote for a ceasefire. I've seen this all over Instagram, sort of people saying, send a message to your MP to demand that they vote for a ceasefire. I'm sure that will have affected some people's decision-making this evening as well. Of course, we'll be coming back to this story once the vote comes in after 7 p.m, so do stay tuned for that. After days of encircling the Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza City, last night Israeli troops entered the building. An IDF spokesperson gave this description of the operation.
Based on intelligence information and an operational necessity, IDF forces are carrying out a precise and targeted operation against Hamas in a specified area in the Shifa hospital. The IDF is conducting a ground operation in Gaza to defeat Hamas and rescue our hostages. Israel is at war with Hamas, not with the civilians in Gaza. The IDF forces include medical teams and Arabic speakers who have undergone specified training to prepare for this complex and sensitive environment, with the intent that no harm is caused to the civilians being used by Hamas as human shields.
So a promise there that no civilians would be harmed. But news emerging from inside the hospital tells a different story. This footage shows the aftermath of an Israeli strike on the intensive care unit in the Shifa hospital last night. You can see smoke filling the rooms and operating theatres, as well as rubble all around, while patients are stretchered to safety. And just before the raid began, a doctor working inside Al-Shifa made this desperate call to the IDF.
You being inside the hospital will create a state of fear and hysteria among the patients here. So I'm not interested in hearing this. The hallways are full of people. All floors of the hospital are full of people, from floor 1 through to 6. You keep saying if this will create a problem for you. If you want to enter and see for yourself, the hospital is full of people. The reception and surgery unit is full of displaced people. Dialysis unit is full of people. Delivery, radiology, administration are empty. In the burns unit on the right side of the hospital, that's full of patients and full of displaced people too.
It's just unbelievable. And I mean, you got to think of the sort of decision that people in that hospital are being forced to make. Now, one, many of them just physically can't leave, right? Because they're undergoing treatment. You know, they're on a dialysis machine, right? They're physically injured, so they can't leave. But then also, even if you were, physically fit and you were being told to leave the hospital, well, you know what happens outside the hospital, right? Which is that, so we'll leave the hospital because the troops are going to come in. Then we'll just get bombed on the outside. Now, even with the IDF saying, please, you need to leave the hospital because it's unsafe, it seems reasonable to me to think, well, the hospital's still probably going to be safer than anywhere else because at least international attention is on it. If they kill us in the hospital, at least there'll be a little bit of outrage. If they kill us in a building 3 blocks down, then no one's going to notice. So, what are you supposed to do? You're putting people in such an impossible situation. Right. Now, to give a sense of the kind of operation underway, it's important to know that the Al-Shifa is not just a single building, but a large complex. Now, this satellite image shows the scale of that complex with several buildings arranged around a large central courtyard. There are currently around 700 patients, 400 medical staff, and over 2,000 displaced Palestinians trapped inside the grounds. The BBC's Gaza correspondent Rushdie Abalouf gave this report on Israel's incursion into the hospital.
Around 2:30 in the morning, local time, 12:30 GMT, according to our source inside the hospital, about 6 Israeli tanks and enter the courtyard of the hospital with about 100 Israeli commandos soldiers started to move inside the emergency department, quoting the Khader Zanoun, a witness inside the hospital. He said they were shouting in Arabic, screaming, don't move, don't move. And there were medics among them. And they enter the main department, the emergency, and is the biggest department in the hospital. And it's like 4 or 5 story building. So they started interrogating the medical staff and the patient.
The Israeli military claims that they've given people inside the hospital ample warning to leave. But in his report, Abalouf cast doubt on whether they would be able to.
The main gate of the hospital was open, but for the last 72 hours, nobody was allowed out, in or out. So everybody in the hospital now are staying there for the last 3 days. Since 3 days, nobody was allowed to go in and out of the hospital. We was in contact all the time with some medical staff inside, and our witness who's, by the way, the last journalist operating from the hospital. They said nobody was allowed in and out for the last 3 days, and today, about 2:30 in the morning, tanks moved and soldiers started to search. What he told me now is that they are searching from room to room. They finished the ground floor and they started in the second floor, where he is now locating in the second floor of the hospital. And they said they investigate, they talk to, interrogate the people, the medical staff and the patient inside, and the people who were civilians displaced, they interrogate them outside within the car park and the courtyard of the hospital.
That's important for us to know just from a sort of basic humanitarian perspective. I mean, we need to know what these people are going through. And I mean, it should be obvious to anyone that it's completely awful and Israel's actions here are completely unjustifiable. It also matters legally, right? That was important information because international humanitarian law requires the protection of civilians during hostilities, including by allowing them to escape military targets. Instead, the IDF seem to have been shooting those trying to flee in the legs. Al-Shifa is now under a communications blackout, with the World Health Organization saying they've lost contact with medical staff inside. But emergency room employee Omar Zakwat managed to tell Al Jazeera this. They've detained and brutally assaulted some of the men who were taking refuge at the hospital. Israeli forces took the detained men naked and blindfolded. They did not bring any aid or supplies. They only brought terror and death. More than 180 dead bodies, are deteriorating and still lying in the hospital's yard. The situation is very terrifying. Gunshots are heard everywhere in the hospital's perimeters. Israel's justification for targeting the hospital is that Hamas is using it as a base. So far, they've produced no evidence for this claim. However, I am confident that at some point we will be seeing footage from tunnels under the hospital. Why, you ask? Well, because Israel built them itself. Now, Israel last invaded Gaza in 2014. That same year, an article in the Tablet magazine reported this. The Israelis are so sure about the location of the Hamas bunker, however, not because they are trying to score propaganda points or because it has been repeatedly mentioned in passing by Western reporters, but because they built it. Back in 1983, when Israel still ruled Gaza, they built a secure underground operating room and tunnel network beneath Shifa Hospital, which is one among several reasons why Israeli security sources are so sure that there is a main Hamas command bunker in or around the large cement basement beneath the area of Building 2 of the hospital, which reporters are obviously prohibited from entering. It was discussed on yesterday's show. We've seen these videos where you get this IDF soldier showing gullible journalists around some building that or some room that they say sort of, oh, because of this calendar on the wall, it means that hostages were held here and that this is a headquarters for Hamas. We don't know what's the case, but if you see some tunnels under Shifa Hospital, that doesn't mean it's Hamas headquarters because Israel built them, right? Now, also in 2014, Israel launched an attack on the Al-Shifa hospital, again using the presence of a Hamas base as the justification. They later changed their mind. Now, this is from the academic journal International Review of the Red Cross. Israel justified its attack on Al-Shifa hospital by claiming that Hamas had established a, quote, large underground bunker equipped with sophisticated communications equipment, unquote, underneath the hospital, which would qualify as an act harmful to the enemy. The same day, 1 hour after Al-Shifa was attacked, another strike landed near the hospital and hit Al-Shati refugee camp. This strike killed 10 Palestinians, 9 of them children. Israel denied responsibility for the attack and instead blamed the attack on Hamas. The IDF later released a statement saying this, quote, Al-Shifa hospital was struck by a failed rocket attack launched by Gaza terror organizations. A barrage of free rockets that were aimed towards Israel struck the hospital. At the time of the incident, there were no Israeli military activity in the area surrounding the hospital whatsoever. So we have a situation where Israel said they would attack a hospital. A strike then lands near a hospital and kills a number of civilians. Then Israel says the attack was in fact Hamas. Now, this might all sound rather familiar to you. Okay, we've seen this before. Now, back to the present moment, neither side has presented conclusive proof as to whether Hamas do use hospitals as bases, but medical staff do appear skeptical. Now, NHS surgeon Abdel Hamad has worked at the Al-Shifa hospital. He told Sky News this.
Israel say that they are carrying out this targeted, in their words, operation because Hamas is using this hospital as a base. What's your response to that?
I mean, I know that building, which they are occupying at the moment and searching. And to be honest, I mean, I've been to all parts of that building. I never seen a military situation in that building. And what surprised me, even the building, everywhere in the building is accessible to people. I mean, to the public, to the medics, to patients. So I'd be surprised, really, what they are saying, because, I mean, if it is a center for Hamas, they would have not allowed people to have access to that. But people have access to all sides of that building. And I think the problem now is the hospital is non-operational. The patients are, I don't know what will happen to the patients, and the medical staff is obviously in this situation, which I am worried about their safety.
A senior member of the IDF has now said that weapons and, quote, terror infrastructure have been found at the hospital, though without providing any evidence. But whatever the situation with any bunker now, there are thousands of civilians currently sheltering in Al-Shifa with no access to the outside world and no international monitors to ensure their safety, which means international condemnation of the attack has been plentiful. This is from Doctors Without Borders. As Israeli forces enter Al-Shifa hospital, we call once again for the protection of medical staff, patients and displaced civilians sheltered inside the hospital. We are extremely worried for their lives. UN Aid Chief Martin Griffiths said this: I'm appalled by reports of military raids in Al-Shifa hospital in Gaza. The protection of newborns, patients, medical staff and all civilians must override all other concerns. Hospitals are not battlegrounds. Now, as I say, I think we should be very skeptical about Israeli claims about where Hamas are and are not based. At the same time, as I say, conclusive proof hasn't been provided either way. I don't know what Israel are going to present to the world over the next couple of days. I think what's very important to keep in mind, though, because I am nervous about, them finding something and saying, aha, we were justified, therefore, in bombing this hospital and bombing all the hospitals in Gaza, which I think is going to be the message coming from IDF and their outriders, right? Whatever is underneath a hospital, that doesn't give you the right to bomb it and cause a shed loads of death inside, right? As we've described, humanitarian law means you have to be able to provide people safe passage out of that place. They haven't done that. And this has to be proportionate. I was saying this on the radio yesterday, right? If there is a claim that Israel has a right to sort of bomb civilian infrastructure because that civilian infrastructure is protecting Hamas infrastructure or military infrastructure, then they have to be arguing that 50% of civilian infrastructure in Gaza is hiding military infrastructure. Now, that's completely implausible, right? You would need a huge army for that to be the case. You would need an enormous cache of weapons for that to be the case. Now, Hamas is, it has proven to be more of a threat than people thought it was before October the 7th. But it is not going to have a military headquarters under 50% of the buildings in Gaza. It doesn't make any sense. It's completely implausible. So there is no way that you can possibly say that this is proportionate and this is targeted when they have destroyed half of Gaza. Now, to me, as we were saying in the first segment, this seems more like a plan to make Gaza unlivable. And obviously, if you're trying to make a territory unlivable, going for the hospitals makes a lot of sense, right? If you were trying to, in a sort of targeted way, take out a terrorist group, then bombing 50% of the buildings in a territory and bombing pretty much all of its hospitals, right? That wouldn't make much sense. It does make sense if what you're trying to do is create a humanitarian crisis and then sort of blackmail the rest of the world to say, oh, we're not expelling Gazans, but we were forced to create this humanitarian crisis because of Hamas, by the way, all Hamas's fault. But we created this humanitarian crisis, and now it's so desperate that unfortunately, the 2.2 million inhabitants of Gaza are going to have to leave. Now, whenever this sort of hospital issue has come up and people say, are Hamas in a bunker, are Hamas aren't in a bunker, you need to make sure that you have in your head the big picture here, which is this is not a targeted strike. Israel has destroyed Gaza. It's continuing to destroy Gaza. And if you listen to the words of their own politicians, the reason is not to take out a terrorist group. It's to make Gaza unlivable.
I think the reason why these kinds of moments, the Al-Shifa hospital sort of storming, the Al-Ahli hospital bombing, the bombing of the refugee camp in Gaza that we saw recently too, why these moments provoke and attract so much sort of attention in the kind of news coverage of this war is because they expose the sort of Janus-faced way in which Israel is talking about the war, the way that it's talking about it internally, and the way that it's talking about it to the rest of the world. Now, to the rest of the world, Israel is saying we're undertaking this war to sort of rout Hamas, and we need to totally destroy Hamas in order to guarantee Israel's security and the prevention of further attacks like Operation Al-Aqsa Flood on the 7th of October. But internally, and in a sort of stage whisper, you might say, because you've quoted some of the things that they've been saying to sort of domestic audience, they're talking about a second Nakba. They're talking about depopulation, raising Gaza, making it uninhabitable, and moments like this hospital invasion sort of demonstrate the sort of untenability of these two positions, because they're not, as you say, making the kinds of provisions that an aggressor would make in order to protect civilians and only target Hamas. They're making the kind of moves that a military would make in order to destroy an entire civilian infrastructure and make Gaza uninhabitable, as you've said. We know that is Israel's ultimate aim here, and Israel's ultimate conception of Palestinians. There are no Palestinian innocent civilians. That's what President Isaac Herzog recently told journalists. It's an entire population, he said. It's an entire nation out there that's responsible, he said on the 13th of October, an entire month ago now. And so, internally, it's the numbers that Israel's presenting to its own population, the total number of people that it's killed, it describes as terrorists. Now, that includes children who've died, non-combatants who've died. Israel sees them all as part of the same sort of Hamas supporting polis, and obviously synonymizes Hamas with ISIS and all sorts of insane conflations that we don't need to go into. But I think what we see in moments like this Al-Shifa hospital storming is that Israel isn't trying to distinguish between civilians and Hamas operatives, and it's struggling to maintain that sort of outward sort of line by constantly shifting its justification. Yesterday we saw the White House saying that it had independent intelligence to suggest that Hamas was using Al-Shifa as a base for holding hostages. Today, the IDF completely gave up that line and just said, nah, wasn't about hostages. Yes, maybe there were some tunnels or bases or whatever, but hostages, no. And so the reason why these justifications keep shifting and Israel keeps trying to kind of pump out more and more absurd propaganda of its, soldiers, we saw recently that timetable of supposed, Hamas operatives taking it in turns to man a base in a hospital. We've seen an Israeli actress brought in to supposedly like impersonate a Gazan hospital employee. So Israel will continue to pump out this kind of more and more absurd propaganda to try and justify its actions on some kind of humanitarian basis to appeal to a certain type of supposed liberal democracy like the US and the UK, whilst internally making absolutely no bones about the fact that all Gazans, all Palestinians are the target and hospitals are completely legitimate targets. I think we saw a tweet saying something along those lines, deleted by Israel recently, saying that hospitals are legitimate targets. So it's constantly trying to kind of manage this inherent tension between what it's saying, I suppose, to the West and what it's saying internally. And at these moments, that tension can't really hold.
Attacking hospitals, of course, isn't a great look for Israel, right? But condemnation from their allies has been incredibly tepid. Now, Joe Biden has said the Shifa hospital should be protected, but he's only demanded, quote, less intrusive action at the hospital. So less intrusive, right? Now, he doesn't seem to want to keep the hospital completely out of the war, just less intrusive action than they've done elsewhere. I don't know what that means. You've seen the images which show that it looks pretty goddamn intrusive what the Israelis are doing there. Crucially, because words are just words, right? The Americans have given no indication they will condition Israeli aid, including vast amounts of weaponry, on whether or not Israel destroys health facilities, right? It's all very well to say, oh, we'd like you to do this in a more civilized way. But if you are arming them, if you are giving them the funds they need to do that, and crucially the diplomatic support which enables this, then those words mean nothing. And even in the realm of words, right? America took a very different tone, when it was Russia doing the bombing. In March 2022, Hillary Clinton tweeted this: if Russian leadership would rather not be accused of committing war crimes, they should stop bombing hospitals. Right on, Hillary Clinton, right on. Now, in contrast in this war, Hillary Clinton has this week written an article for The Atlantic opposing a ceasefire in Gaza. So when it was Russia, he wasn't interested. Any sort of Putin explanation. Oh, they've been using the hospital as a military base. They've been fighting from the hospital. Hillary Clinton will say, "Well, if you don't want to be accused of anything, just stop bombing the hospital." Now, when Israel makes that excuse, suddenly it's valid. Take a look at what the current Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, thought about the bombing of hospitals when it was Russia doing it.
We can never let the crimes Russia's committing become our new normal. Bucha is not normal. Mariupol is not normal. Irpin is not normal. Bombing schools and hospitals and apartment buildings to rubble is not normal.
It's not normal. Bombing hospitals is not normal. Well, you have made it normal, right? The United States has made that normal. In Russia, they tried to gather the whole world and say, this is unacceptable, we can't make this normal. All of you have got to sanction Russia. Now, I've got no problem with sanctions on Russia, right? But when it comes to Israel, the US don't just say, oh, actually, we're going to ignore this one. The US provide Israel with all the diplomatic cover they need to get away with this. So whenever anything comes to the UN Security Council, it is the US who veto it if it's criticizing Israel. So when it came to Russia, we can't make this stuff normal. They are making this stuff normal every day, right? Mariupol, Gaza City. The comparisons are strong. One of them, America found that outrageous. The other, America is backing Israel to the hilt. The Supreme Court has ruled that the Tories' Rwanda plan is unlawful. The judgment is based on concerns the court had over the safety of Rwanda as a destination for asylum seekers. At a press conference this afternoon, Rishi Sunak gave this response to the ruling.
We have prepared for all outcomes of this case. And so we have been working on a new international treaty with Rwanda. This will provide a guarantee in law that those who are relocated from the UK to Rwanda will be protected against removal from Rwanda. And it will make clear that we will bring back anyone if ordered to do so by a court. We will finalise the treaty in light of today's judgment and ratify it without delay. But we need to end the merry-go-round. I said I was going to fundamentally change our country, and I meant it. So I'm also announcing today that we will take the extraordinary step of introducing emergency legislation. This will enable Parliament to confirm that with our new treaty, Rwanda is safe. It will ensure that people cannot further delay flights by bringing systemic challenges in our domestic courts and stop our policy being repeatedly blocked.
Now, that reference to emergency legislation is a way of bypassing the courts. Now, in their unanimous judgment, the Supreme Court said that asylum seekers could not legally be sent to Rwanda because of the risk of refoulement. Now, refoulement is the forcible return of asylum seekers to their country of origin when there is a risk of persecution, and it's illegal under both European and other international law. Now, the court's conclusion was based on Rwanda's record of wrongly rejecting refugees from war zones like Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan, as well as its mistreatment of refugees already in Rwanda. Sunak wants to get around this by signing a new treaty with Rwanda and then getting Parliament, rather than the courts, to declare it to be safe. So essentially saying, well, the courts don't say it's safe. Well, Parliament will then say it's safe. If you disagree with me, I will make new facts. But Sunak also went further.
We must be honest about the fact that even once Parliament has changed the law here at home, we could still face challenges from the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. I told Parliament earlier today that I'm prepared to change our laws and revisit those international relationships to remove the obstacles in our way. So let me tell everybody now, I will not allow a foreign court to block these flights. If the Strasbourg court chooses to intervene against the expressed wishes of Parliament, I am prepared to do what is necessary to get flights off. I will not take the easy way out, because I fundamentally do not believe that anyone thinks the founding aims of the European Convention on Human Rights was to stop a sovereign parliament removing illegal migrants to a country deemed to be safe in parliamentary statute and binding international law.
The Supreme Court judgment explicitly said it wasn't relying on the European Convention of Human Rights when it made its ruling. That's because they say other treaties like the Geneva Convention on Refugees, which is enshrined in multiple domestic laws, would still make the scheme illegal. Right? So they're saying it's not actually about the European Convention. So why is Sunak bringing it up? Well, he'll be hoping that will appease some of his right-wing MPs. Now, this was, well, they're all quite right-wing, aren't they? But they're far-right MPs. This was Jacob Rees-Mogg earlier today on GB News.
There are a lot of people in Parliament who are very committed to the European Convention on Human Rights, and quite a few in the Conservative Party. So then the question becomes, can you get a parliamentary majority for this? And I think you could get a parliamentary majority, not for withdrawing from the convention, but from doing what we did with prisoner voting rights and overriding it for a period in these specific circumstances. I think there is a majority in the Commons for that, and ultimately the Lords must give in to the Democratic House.
On Politics Live, Tory MP Jonathan Gullis went even further, saying this.
We've got some ideas. Number one is that Danny Kruger, Bill Cash and myself did put forward a notwithstanding amendment to the Illegal Migration Act before obviously it passed through the House of Commons. The Prime Minister could bring forward a notwithstanding bill to disapply all treaties and conventions that we're signed up to.
All of them, so not just the European Convention on Human Rights that you've talked about. Yes, we heard that,
Lord
absolutely.
Reid referred to, obviously, the UN signatories as well, like the Refugee Convention in 1951. Another idea is that we actually use the powers in the Nationality and Borders Act to literally push back boats as they're crossing the channel into French territorial waters. I would personally have no issue with us actually taking people back to French shores immediately.
Well, you know, of course, that's been tried. That's been tried by Suella Braverman, in fact, and Priti Patel, and it was dropped.
But ultimately, the government has to now, in my opinion, go into a deep full review of all our obligations under international treaties and convention, because the sovereignty of our country should not be in question.
Well, that view aligns with the view of the former Home Secretary. Around half an hour before Sunak's press conference, Suella Braverman said this. Today's Supreme Court judgment is no surprise. It was predicted by a number of people close to the process. Given the current state of the law, there is no reason to criticise the judges. Instead, the government must introduce emergency legislation. The bill must block off the European Convention, the Human Rights Act, and other routes of legal challenge. This will give Parliament a clear choice: control illegal migration or explain to the British people why they should accept ever greater numbers of illegal arrivals settling here. Now, one thing that the Supreme Court's judgment doesn't undermine is the principle of outsourcing asylum to a third country. So an alternative plan would also be to find another third country to make a deal with. But whether Sunak does that or pursues a new Rwanda treaty, it's likely to lead to further appeals and lengthy delays on policy that's already cost hundreds of millions of pounds. And some Tories have had enough. Natalie Elphicke is usually a fairly right-wing Tory, but she's also MP for Dover, a constituency in which many small boats come ashore. She made this suggestion on Sky News.
I think we need to move forward and look at all the other measures that can come forward to help stop the small boats. You know, there have been a huge amount of other steps and other work that has been undertaken over the last couple of years, and that's had real results on the ground. We've had this third down on numbers of arrivals in small boats. That's around 14,500 people. That's really quite a marked change. So we need to look at what works. We need to be practical, and we need to stop those boats leaving France in the first place.
Some of your colleagues are calling for the UK to pull out of the European Convention on Human Rights. They think that could stop this policy being snarled up in the courts. Do you agree with them?
The Supreme Court decision wasn't a decision of the European Court. It wasn't some Strasbourg judge somewhere far away. It was the most senior of the judges in our land, and their position was absolutely clear. We need to respect that. The court did say that the agreement in principle of outsourcing wasn't the issue. It was particularly issues around Rwanda. But I think we need to move forward from Rwanda. The planes are not going in the air anytime soon, or perhaps at all. But the small boats crossings continue, and that's where the government's focus must be.
Tories still committed to the Rwanda plan have taken aim at the Supreme Court itself. Brendan Clark-Smith posted this. We've been here before, and then that infamous enemies of the people front page. But one Tory lawmaker had a truly revolutionary idea. The Times' Aubrey Allegretti reported this. Lee Anderson says ministers should go ahead and put planes in the air to Rwanda anyway. When I asked if he was suggesting ignoring the Supreme Court ruling, the Tory deputy chairman said government should ignore the laws and send them straight back. So one solution is just to completely ignore the law, which could have some implications Lee Anderson doesn't expect, but we'll see.
I mean, Suella Braverman says it all in the start of her tweet thread. This was inevitable. You know, ministers Priti Patel and Boris Johnson, when it was them, and now Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman have been warned for the past year and a half that the Rwanda plan isn't workable. It won't even act as an effective deterrent. But this is the problem. When I see sort of, liberal commentators like wringing their hands over the Rwanda plan being battered about in the courts, I just think this was always the point. The point was to set up a fight between the courts, between the judiciary and the executive. This is pure political theatre, a way of sort of creating this shadow boxing match, which doesn't exist between Strasbourg and London. We know from the ruling that it's not the European Court of Human Rights that is the thing that is constraining the Rwanda plan. The UN Convention on Refugees, the UN Convention Against Torture, these things would all have prevented the plan from going ahead, even if the ECHR didn't exist. So the idea that this is some this is an attempt by Europe to constrain UK parliamentary sovereignty is just entirely false and like designed to sort of feed the Tory base, just in the same way that all the small boat crossings are designed to feed the Tory base, just in the same way that the Tories have never intended to genuinely tackle, illegal immigration or the problem, quote unquote, of small boats, because it's fantastic telly for GB News and right-wing media and the Tory voters that watch it. I think, though, this is obviously a hugely concerning shadow boxing match, even if it is a false one. We've had the cross-party legal charity Justice warning that the UK's commitment to the rule of law is under threat because of everything from cuts to legal aid to the kind of poor public consultations, such as the one that we saw over the Illegal Migration Act, all the way through to the kind of extreme and repeated and excessive use of what are known as Henry VIII powers, which we saw with the Brexit Act. We are seeing a major challenge to the legitimacy of our legislature. And again, I would draw really obvious parallels between the UK and, for example, Israel. What was Netanyahu battling just before the war in Gaza broke out? He was battling resistance to his attempted reforms to the Supreme Court. What has Hungary recently done? Attempted to reform its Supreme Court. Poland, exactly the same. We are seeing a massive resistance in right-wing and far-right governments across Europe to the authority of the legislature, which is made out as being this kind of threat to the sovereignty of the people, when in fact we know that the ECHR, for example, is the reason why we don't have corporal punishment in schools anymore, the reason why we have protections for LGBT people, the reason why the state can't tap our phones, the reason why we don't have inhumanely long detention periods for people arrested on terrorism charges. The courts are there to protect us from our, increasingly flagrantly sort of unhinged politicians, people like Lee Anderson, who would just put someone on a plane regardless of their, eligibility to remain in the UK. The courts protect our sovereignty rather than attack them. And we've got to a place now where our politicians have successfully managed to demonize the courts. And we know where this leads because it happened in 2020. There are direct attacks on judges, direct attacks on lawyers. That happened in 2020 when Duncan Lewis, an immigration law firm, was the subject of a terrorist attack. So, when Brendan Clark-Smith is resharing that headline from the Daily Mail or wherever it was, that's incitement. That is directly going to embolden people on the far right, people that we saw at the Cenotaph at the weekend and people will see more and more of in the coming months, to go and attack judges and lawyers and people in the legal profession. It's as simple as that. It's a deeply scary moment.
Francesca Albanese is the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories, and she has recently given a speech to the Australian Press Club. In the question and answers session, a Guardian journalist named Daniel Hurst asked her this.
I couldn't help but being tripped up by the very ending of your speech where you said that ending Jewish-Israeli domination would be rehumanising acts for them as well. I just want to ask whether that sort of comment is helpful in the current climate, talking about ending Jewish-Israeli domination. You've applied it to that particular context, but you don't think the word domination has a wider connotation outside that context.
What do you mean?
Talking about Israeli-Jewish domination.
Meaning, are you asking me in Israel?
Well, I just, the phrase jumped out at me at the end of your speech, and I'm just wondering if the trope of domination No,
it's not a trope. It's really real. So it seems not to understand what I'm saying. There is an apartheid regime. No, I'm serious. There is an apartheid regime. It's domination. This is not a trope. This is international law. I encourage you to read the Apartheid Convention because it talks about racial domination. And this is what I'm talking about. It might be a trope into the way you interpret it. But I'm using domination in a strictly legal sense.
Thank you very much for answering my questions.
I mean, he had no follow-up, did he? I mean, he was very much put in his place. And how embarrassing! There is a horrific war on Gaza. You are speaking to the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestinians, and all you can think, oh, I heard you say domination. Oh, that sounds a bit dodgy. I know anti-Semitism is in the news at the moment. Do you feel bad that you said domination? Do you think that could be a trope? Like, no. This is what a ridiculous question. And she put him down so effectively. And she was absolutely right to. Now, as she said, racial domination isn't a trope. It's a legal term included within the 1975 UN Convention on Apartheid. Now, this is the relevant passage. For the purpose of the present convention, the term the crime of apartheid, which shall include similar policies and practices of racial segregation and discrimination as practiced in Southern Africa, shall apply to the following inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. Now, the convention then lists a number of actions which are understood to promote racial domination. We also know that the crime of intentional and systematic racial domination is being committed by Israel. Now, this is the front cover of the 2022 Amnesty report, which judged Israel to be guilty of apartheid. So you can see there, Israel's apartheid against Palestinians, cruel system of domination and crime against humanity. So you've got the Guardian journalist who opens that and think, oh, Israel committing apartheid against Palestinians. That sounds kind of boring. Oh, but I can see the word domination. Oh, and we're talking about Israel. Oh, there could be a headline there. That sounds very interesting. Someone from the UN said that Israel might be dominating another racial group, that Jews in Israel are dominating another racial group. Now, as the UN rapporteur said, that's not a trope. That's what's happening, right? It's material. This is not just in the realms of discourse. There is discrimination and domination of people in Israel because they are not Jews, right? Jews in Israel, it is a racial group. There is racial domination between Jews and non-Jews in Israel. Rivkah, this idea that sort of just anything is a trope, right? Powerful Jews is a trope, so you can't talk about how Jews have power in Israel. You know, it's like if you were to talk about South African apartheid without being able to say that white people have more power in South Africa than everyone else.
Right. And I mean, obviously, this environment in which it's impossible to speak about Israeli Jewish domination. Albanese was incredibly precise with her language. She didn't just say Jewish. It was Hurst who abstracted the idea of Jews per se from what she was saying. So in a way, it's Hurst's own unconscious anti-Semitic biases that we should be questioning. But, you know, this idea that it's impossible to critique Israeli Jewish domination without being accused of anti-Semitism is a situation that obviously Israel has constructed quite deliberately to insulate itself from criticism. It's also so evidently not a trope. It's enshrined in Israeli law. You know, the 2018 nation state law literally says that the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to Jewish people. Only Jewish people have the right to self-determine in the state of Israel. And Jewish domination is inscribed in Israeli law. It's inscribed in the convention of the ruling party, of Bibi's Likud party, that between the river and the sea, there will be only Israeli Jewish sovereignty. Coincidentally rhymes. Perhaps they should be using it as their chants on their marches. This idea that that Hurst is kind of suggesting, and I think the kind of interaction that you see between them shows how deeply removed journalists' understanding of the situation is from the material reality. We're continually told, you know, criticism of Israel is legitimate if it's well informed, if it's reasonable. There is no one, perhaps on this planet, who knows more about the situation on the ground than Francesca Albanese at this moment. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories. She knows so much about the kind of regime of racial domination that Israel is maintaining. And yet, when she attempts to speak about it, she's still smeared as anti-Semitic. It shows how impossible the discourse around Israeli policy, even when it's forensically detailed, even when it's extremely well informed and highly specific in its language, Israeli Jews, not Jews per se, it's impossible to launch any criticism of Israel in this environment, in a Western media environment that extends clearly not just from the UK to the US, but all the way to Australia.
We are going to now go over to the House of Commons. MPs have just voted on the Labour amendment. So that was the amendment from the front bench, the mealy-mouthed one that I was telling you about. They want a ceasefire at some point in the future when it's possible. The Starmer motion that was terrible, essentially. So we will get a result on that very soon. In the meantime, we know that Yasmin Qureshi has resigned as Shadow Women and Equalities Minister. That makes her the second shadow frontbencher to resign over the issue after Imran Hussain last week. And we can expect, of course, sackings from the other MPs who have publicly stated they will defy Starmer today. Rivkah, I want some of your thoughts on this. What should our viewers be looking out for when we get these results? What kind of number might Keir Starmer be comfortable with when it comes to the rebels from his own party?
I mean, it's been suggested that around a dozen, maybe up to even 15 could rebel. And these are, many of these are not MPs traditionally thought to be on the left. People like Jess Phillips and Kim Ledbetter are considered, I suppose Kim Ledbetter is part of the Socialist Campaign Group, but others such as Sarah Owen or Paula Barker, not people that we traditionally associate with the left, and certainly not members of the Socialist Campaign Group within the party are thought to be potential defectors. One of the central kind of themes and commonalities that a lot of these rumoured defectors share is that they sit in constituencies with large Muslim populations. So, for example, Sarah Owen is MP for Luton with a constituent which has a Muslim population of about 48%. That's enormous. In London, it's about 15%, I believe. But other MPs like Jess Phillips, who, like I said, is traditionally thought to be more in the kind of centre of the party, if not the centre right, particularly on her views around things like gender and women and trans rights, sits in Birmingham Yardley, which has a 30% Muslim population. Now, I'm saying this partly because...
Rivkah, I'm just going to interrupt you because we are just going to go to the House of Commons now. Remember, this is the results for the Labour frontbench amendment.
Thank you. The ayes to the right, 183. The noes to the left, 290. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. I am anticipating 3 more divisions.
So MPs have voted against the Labour frontbench amendment. Now, in a way, that's a relief. There was some discussion earlier today from sort of political journalists that maybe the Tories would vote for the Labour frontbench amendment, which would mean that we wouldn't have any votes on the SNP amendment because they would be superseded. I never really understood why they would do that, because the Tories love seeing the Labour Party divided. So we are going to see a vote on those meaningful ceasefire amendments, not Labour's, the Labour frontbench's sort of pointless ceasefire amendment. So we still have that to look forward to. Rivkah, when it comes to sort of the results we're going to see, how would you judge what's going to be most important in terms of how Labour MPs vote? Do you think this is about principle? Do you think it's a sort of left wing of the party versus the right wing of the party? Do you think it's about the demographics of people's constituencies? Do you think it's how much pressure, how many emails they've received? I mean, what do you think is going through the minds of people who are deciding whether or not to vote with the leadership?
I think it's the recognition that, I think obviously there is some cynicism at play. And, we have some MPs who are both principled, but also sitting in incredibly precarious positions. People like Kim Ledbetter, who won in 2021 by a margin of something like 320 people. So obviously there are considerations about one's safety in one seat. And I'm not suggesting that that's not at play, but I do think that there's a recognition, a growing recognition, precipitated by the, enormous mass movements that we've seen, hundreds of thousands of people, almost 1 million people last weekend just in London. Across the country, it's probably over 1 million people that have come out in support for Palestine, including some of these constituencies like Birmingham, that has, I think, brought home to MPs that this is an extra parliamentary. This is of extra parliamentary significance. I think often there's a tendency within the Labour Party to be quite kind of navel gazing and inward looking and think about things in terms of the internal politics of the party. But I think the positions, the sort of seeming moves towards backing a ceasefire of people like Jess Phillips suggests to me a recognition that this is about more than internal Labour Party politics, and this is a moment which we can't come back from. Gaza is not, this is a moment of no return. I think, you were saying this earlier, the longer that there isn't a ceasefire, the more likely it becomes that there will not be a return of Palestinians to Gaza, that it will become a kind of dead zone under some kind of either Israeli control or international control. With, there's been talks of Israel either reducing the territory of Gaza, suggesting that some of it might be annexed, or kind of maintaining a sort of security control over it. This is an enormously pivotal moment in the history of this conflict, and a sort of Rubicon, I think, that some Labour MPs have recognised is more important than a party whip, more important than their positions on a shadow front bench. I think things in Gaza are moving so rapidly that Labour's own position on this between now and the next general election, which could be in more than a year's time, could well change. The US's position could well change, and the sooner MPs make their principled stances clear, Naz Shah saying that a ceasefire is going to happen sooner rather than later. Well, you might as well back one now. If it emerges in a year's time that Labour is going to back a ceasefire, or hopefully in sooner than a year, those MPs who maybe lost their positions on the front bench could well be in the running for a job in government nevertheless. So I think there's maybe a recognition even amongst the sort of more ruthlessly ambitious Labour MPs that this is going to be so much bigger than this particular moment, and it's simply not worth sort of following the party whip on at this time, because not least because Labour is so prone to U-turning. But how do we know that it's not going to support a ceasefire in a week's time anyway, leaving those who voted, for a ceasefire vindicated, and those who voted against it sort of none the more stable in their jobs, if you see what I mean.
Let's look at one of the absolute worst people in the Labour Party, Luke Akehurst. So he's on the NEC, on the National Executive Committee. He is also director of a lobby group, We Believe in Israel. And he had a response to the parliamentary debate today that I want to get your thoughts on, Rivkah. So he says, there's a certain post-colonial arrogance to British MPs thinking they can tell the elected government of another democracy that it has to stop fighting to defend its people after the worst terrorist atrocities since 9/11. The former mandatory power should stay in its lane. Whatever you think about the whole one-state, two-state question, now, as I often explain on this show, people who are in favor of sort of like a one-state solution, they say the occupation of Palestine began 75 years ago. The whole thing is illegitimate. Now, people who are more two-staters say, well, the UN in 1948 did give Israel a mandate to be on sort of half the land of historic Palestine. So in that part of historic Palestine, it's not an occupation. But in the parts they occupied after the 1967, sorry, I always get that wrong, the 1967 war, everyone agrees that is an occupation. Everyone agrees that the West Bank is occupied and it's being colonized, right? Because you have settlers moving in there. You got 500,000 settlers who are living on land which the whole world recognized as part of Israel. And still, Luke Akehurst, right, who's not just some internet troll, he is on Labour's National Executive Committee, thinks that it is post-colonial arrogance to ask Israel, which has been occupying Palestine for 56 years, to stop bombing Palestinian hospitals.
I'm surprised that Luke Akehurst even knows the word post-colonial, if I'm honest. I mean, like, he should stay in his lane. If he thinks that it's arrogant for people of conscience to speak out against, the razing of Gaza, then why is he doing exactly the same just on Israel's behalf? I don't think it's wrong that he should do that. I think it's absolutely, understandable that he should. I think he's a weird guy who has like a obsession with, framing himself as the, hero of the Jews, the savior of the Jews. But I think he's within his rights to have his views on Israel and Palestine. And he probably does so in part because of Britain's very involved relationship with Palestine and the foundation of the state of Israel, which I think is why a lot of people in this country feel, like Britain has a particular responsibility. In some ways, I agree with Germany saying that it has a particular historic responsibility towards Israel. I just disagree what that responsibility is. I think Britain shares that responsibility, having previously had a mandate over Palestine and being instrumental in creating Israel through the Balfour Declaration, which, by the way, the only Jewish minister in Arthur Balfour's cabinet, whose name I've momentarily forgotten, voted against, saying he didn't think that there was such a thing as a Jewish nation. Anyway, that episode of history is often forgotten. But, it's outrageous. But what's interesting is that Luke Akehurst is recognizing, even that by using the term post-colonial, that we're in a colonial occupation, that one is ongoing, and that acknowledgement is exactly why so many people care about it. There's so few, there's virtually no comparable situations in the world right now. So some would say West Papua has some echoes with what's going on in Palestine, but there's colonization for the most part ended in the late 20th century, at the mid to late 20th century, and Israel and Palestine is a massive hangover of that, and an exception globally. It's an apartheid state of the like that we haven't seen since South Africa. So it's totally understandable that people would care about this, and the reasons they do are embedded within Luke Akehurst's tweet.
We've got a couple more updates before those final votes come in. So some resignations. Paula Barker, Shadow Minister for Devolution, she's resigned. I think from the Liverpool area. Afzal Khan has resigned as well. He was Shadow Minister for Devolution, and then Afzal Khan, Shadow Minister for Exports. Someone who isn't resigning, who we have discussed this evening, is Kim Ledbetter. Now, she's released a video explaining her decision.
Hello, I'm Kim Ledbetter, the Member of Parliament for Batley and Spen, and I just wanted to send out a short message ahead of the vote in Parliament this evening, which sets out my position clearly. Of course, I want a ceasefire in Gaza. Which human being on this planet wouldn't? But what I won't be doing this evening is voting for the SNP amendment. And the reason I won't be doing that is because even if I did, nothing would change. There is no quick and simple solution to the crisis in Gaza. We have to set out a framework which leads towards that much-needed ceasefire, and I believe that's what the Labour Party amendment does. This has probably been the hardest day of my relatively short political career, but that is nothing compared to the pain and suffering of the people involved in the attack on October the 7th and the suffering now that we're seeing in Gaza. We have to work towards a solution to alleviating that pain for everybody, releasing the hostages, getting rid of Hamas, and ending the pain and suffering of the people of that region who have suffered for far too long. That's why I'll be doing what I'm doing.
Oh, that was disgusting, actually. I had quite a visceral reaction to that. Now, I want a ceasefire. But more important than a ceasefire to me is not voting with the SNP. Like, how pathetic do you sound? And then the language she's used, right? This is the pressure that Keir Starmer is putting people on, right? I can't imagine the pain of the people who were killed in the attacks on the 7th. And I'm also concerned about the suffering in Gaza. On October the 7th, those were attacks. The problem in Gaza is suffering, right? No mention of Israel bombing shed loads of family homes, bombing hospitals, attacking hospitals, right? That's just suffering. We're going to go to Parliament now.
125. For noes to the left, 293.
125 people voted for the SNP amendment.
The ayes to the right, 125. The noes to the left, 293. So the noes have it, the noes have it. Unlock. I now call Ed Davey to move Amendment K.
So that's potentially somewhat high. I mean, we didn't expect the amendment to pass. So what we really want to wait for now is news about which MPs, and especially which Labour MPs, voted for the amendment, because they are the ones who would have broken the whip. Of course, the SNP were whipped to vote for the SNP amendment, as one would imagine. That makes sense. Rivkah, your thoughts on those numbers while we sort of look into which MPs did and did not break the whip?
It's disappointing. It's hard to not have as you say, a visceral reaction to hearing the overwhelming no. But I suppose there are still like almost 200, 120 MPs, I think they said, that voted for this amendment, which is
I like that's very glass half full, almost 200 when it's 125. That is one way of looking at it.
I revised down. My brain is fried. But so that must be, I mean, that's like a solid, what will that almost definitely be at least like 50 Labour MPs, including, lots of the non-frontbenchers. But, that sounds like quite a decent number. But as you said, this is not a vote on whether or not there will be a ceasefire in Gaza. Whatever happens, in the UK Parliament, Israel has been given a blank check, both literally, both financially and diplomatically by the US. It's primary international backer and diplomatic ally. And it's going to continue regardless. Obviously, the UK could have taken a principled stance to distance itself from what was going on, and a historic stance, and it's chosen not to. But yeah, like you, I'm much more interested in who within the Labour Party is joining the SNP, because that, I think, will be the real litmus test of where public opinion and where the Labour Party is at on this issue. Because, as you said, the Starmer's still ahead in the polls, but that's primarily due to the Tories' kind of implosion. There could be ways that Sunak could claw back quite a bit of support, particularly from the far right, over things like the Rwanda plan. If he's going to go whole hog against the ECHR, that could rally a huge amount of far right support, which might then, bring him closer to where Starmer currently is. But similarly, Starmer is moving backwards because of the implosion of his own party. Labour Party division has the potential, as we've seen with Jeremy Corbyn, to totally wreck its electoral chances. And particularly splits over questions of principle, because the Labour Party's main distinguishing quality from the Conservatives is that it is it's not the nasty party. But if Labour falls apart because too many MPs within it perceive it to be a nasty party, a party of genocide, a party of unlimited warfare, then it could well undermine the party's electoral chances.
The thing I just find so pathetic is people who say, I really care about a ceasefire, but I'm not going to vote for one. If you really want a ceasefire, but you prioritize Israel's military operation to destroy Hamas, then you don't want a ceasefire, right? Then you don't want a ceasefire. If it's as simple as that. I would love a ceasefire, but I'm prioritizing Israel's criminal military operation, which they say is to get rid of Hamas, but we all kind of know is to make Gaza unlivable. Right. If you want a ceasefire, vote for a ceasefire. I would vote for a ceasefire, but it doesn't really matter anyway. And also, I want them to be able to keep on fighting so that they can destroy Hamas. Which one is it? Right. Either you didn't vote for a ceasefire because you want one, but you don't think it's going to matter that much anyway because it's the United States that controls this and the vote wasn't going to pass. Or you didn't vote for a ceasefire because you think that Israel has every right to keep bombing schools and hospitals because you want to get rid of this terrorist organization, which, by the way, the current prime minister of Israel shed loads of effort into strengthening because he preferred them as his opposing party to Fatah, because he thought that then there would be less pressure on him to make any kind of compromises so he could continue expanding settlements and annexing the West Bank, which, as I say, everyone has admitted is illegal for 56 years, right? So it's so pathetic. It's so ahistorical. Do they even believe this? Like, is this incredibly stupid people? Is this incredibly cynical people? What are we looking at? Rivkah, I think we're going to wind up now. We'll obviously tomorrow have a sort of more full account of who did and who didn't rebel against the Labour leadership and which MPs were and weren't fired. But I think we're sort of getting an idea of what some of these Labour MPs are about. Any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a extremely disappointing evening. Not that it wasn't an inevitability, but a moment where the kind of diametric opposition that this parliament, not just this government, but this entire parliament has to respect for international law. We think of the Tories being the party that throws out the rule book and ships people back to Rwanda, but the former DPP is going to change all that. If anything has proven how united, how much of a uni-party system we have when it comes to absolute and unchecked license for abusers of human rights, so long as those abusers are our diplomatic allies and are undertaking, a kind of a proxy war on our behalf, it's this vote. Anyone who thinks that the next election is going to be about voting for the party of righteousness or the party of progressive values as opposed to the party of conservatism and right-wing nut jobs is totally deluded. The only thing that the next election is going to be about is who gets to decide the terrain on which the left fights. And is that terrain going to be red terrain or blue terrain?
Thank you, Rivkah, and thank you all for watching tonight. Before we go, novaramedia.com/support is where you can go if you want to help us sustain this program, sustain this organization. We are currently running a fundraiser. We're trying to get to 5,000 new paid supporters. If you are one already, thank you so much. If not, do please consider becoming one. For now, we'll be back tomorrow, live again, of course, at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.